All right, we are here with Richard Barton. He runs one of my favorite podcasts, Mad About Movies, with my friend Brian Gill, and he is a TV streaming expert. Thanks for coming on.
Absolutely, Mr. Simpson, a pleasure to be here. And this stuff's always fun to talk about. Brian's probably far more of a better critic than I am on the content, but I'm always more interested in the business side of these things and how they all work and build on top of each other. So, and I work in advertising and in my day job. So all this is very interesting and changing by the minute. So I think it'll be great.
All right. We've got Brian Gill, man, 3 times this year. You're awesome. Thanks for coming in.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me. This is fun. This is way more fun than doing my job. So
baby boom generation grew up. Something exciting came along. Something that had never been in American homes before. The television. And once television was in our homes, it would change the way we entertain ourselves, and it would change the way we think. The first television was put on display in 1929 as part of the Home of Tomorrow. And until the late 40s, TV was just that, an unimaginable part of the future.
When we were little children, there was literally no television. It's not that we didn't have a television. There weren't any televisions.
Without television, life was very different. You couldn't come home from school and watch your favorite TV show. Instead, you did your chores and played outdoors as much as you could. At night, you listened to the radio, read books, or played board games. When you wanted to have fun, you had to entertain yourself. So when people started watching television for the first time, it seemed like magic.
TV, was invented in 1927, and then I think what I saw was like 1946. There were only like 6,000 homes with TVs in it.
Wow!
And within 5 years, it's up to like 12 million. So it's an immediate. Within, I believe by 55, it's like half of the homes in America have at least one TV and stuff.
At first, only wealthy families owned televisions. Most towns didn't even have a television station. When WSB-TV in Atlanta began broadcasting in 1948, it was the first TV station in all of the South. Even so, television caught on like wildfire, and by 1960, almost every family owned a TV. And as TV became more and more popular, it began changing families in big ways and small. For one thing, children spent less time playing their 1,000 different games outdoors. Now they were inside, watching TV. They also quit doing something that wouldn't become popular again for many years.
Guess what was really popular before television that kids spent a lot of time with that isn't nearly so popular now? You have any idea? Comic books. Comic books were one of the favorite forms of entertainment for kids who were about 12 years old. They would read comic books, trade comic books. There were a lot of comic books around. And right after television was introduced, the comic book market fell apart.
There were other changes. Instead of listening to the radio, talking, or playing board games, families gathered around the TV set.
What is TV to our culture?
I think, obviously the comparison is to film, but the democratization that TV provided, meaning that everyone could have access to the same content at the same time and all of these things. It built, especially in this country, a real community because, there weren't a lot of options, and it kind of created a monoculture that everyone had access to, or at least a large swath of people had access to.
TV dinners were invented so families could eat and watch TV at the same time. Families quit visiting their neighbors as often. They even started going to bed an hour later just to stay up and watch their favorite shows.
You come to bed at 1 o'clock in the morning.
During the 1940s, television programming was pretty scarce. In the 50s, however, comedies about families were wildly popular. Some of the episodes even centered around getting a television set.
And most of all, I don't want any talk about buying a television set.
Ralph, why can't we have a television set? The Nortons are on their second one. We haven't even had our first one yet.
Everything on television was suitable for anybody in the family to watch. Nowadays, we would say that it was G-rated, or we'd say it's like a G-rated Disney cartoon. But today's Disney cartoons would have been a little bit questionable, maybe. It was such an innocent time, and everything was very respectable.
Even so, there was programming just for children. Some of the shows, like the Mickey Mouse Club, had kids hooked.
Of course, we had the Mouseketeers. That was a big, big deal when I was young.
Hey there, hi there, oh there.
And everybody knew the song. The kids were hooked on it. We wouldn't miss that, and of course...
The innocence of television wouldn't last forever. Before long, news programs were showing some disturbing things, particularly events from the civil rights movement. For years, blacks had been segregated from whites in their communities. They were forced to have separate water fountains, separate restrooms, separate department stores. Now they were asking for change, the right to have good schools, good jobs, and respect. But they faced, often, violent opposition. But with television, the whole world could see how badly these African Americans were being treated.
You have to remember that when television came on the scene in the early 50s, the only people who could afford it were middle and upper class white people. And they tended to live in the North, where all the television stations were. And when they began to see these police dogs and fire hoses and killings and punchings and hangings going on, these people could not believe that this was happening in America.
People were shocked as they saw young students being beaten for trying to go to school. They were angry as they saw African Americans being attacked by dogs and horses, whips and clubs. Because of the power of TV, the people who fought against civil rights also fought against television.
It was primarily men, and mostly white, covering the civil rights movement but it was dangerous. It was very dangerous to be a reporter, to be a camera person in the South. Some of the worst violence was not directed against the young people that were participating in the sit-ins, or the Freedom Ride, or on a march, but it was directed against the camera person, the TV reporter, because they didn't want the people to show this to the nation. And that's why television was so important.
Television showed the violence as well as the inspiration. The leaders of the civil rights movement, men like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., were shown on television. Their speeches, their dreams, their goals were broadcast to the world, and it made all the difference.
That freedom ring from the hyping alligators.
Without television, the civil rights movement would have been like a bird without wings.
During the 60s, television was also changing the way people saw the Vietnam War. In the past, you only saw war at the movies, where Americans were always the heroes and always won. Vietnam was the first real war to be shown on television. Now, families were watching their friends and sons dying on TV. Only this time, the war wasn't make-believe.
The television camera, while it made war a lot smaller than the big movie screen, it made it a lot more personal.
If you went to the water cooler at work, to use like a super old terminology that no one cares about anymore, but like if you're in your cubicle and you are on a break in the break room, there is a very high chance that the thing that you are going to be talking about with your coworkers is whatever was on TV last night.
Of Hollywood mega hits and network television faced up to the challenge of cable.
Shane, it's hard to believe, but back in the dark ages, in the 1970s, there was no MTV, no CNN.
Once upon a time, I mean, there was a land that we lived in where there was just 3 networks, and it was ABC, NBC, and CBS. What happened?
Well, a lot of different things happened. These are what are called broadcasters. They were over-the-air broadcasters. What was great about that is that they could hit a broad market. I mean, if you notice things now, everything is much more. You're in these tiny little silos. Advertisers or whoever, content creators know that Mr. Simpson likes cats and he eats dinner at 3:30. And all, and they can tell you everything about yourself, right? It becomes very specific and very targeted. But these broadcasting, these 3 networks with the limited amount of options really created a, like I talked about earlier, like a mono culture. We all, like you said, everyone watched. You look at these ratings, these shows that were like not even hits, that were canceled after 4 episodes would be 3 times the size of whatever the biggest show, Yellowstone, right?
Right.
They'd be massive hits, and they were considered failures because if you weren't getting what we consider Super Bowl numbers now on Monday night, because again, 3 options, you were failing.
Right.
That for the first like 30 years of television, 40 years of television, there was 3 options and that's it. And at midnight it goes off the air. And I mean, like that is all there is to it. Fox for the reason Fox comes around is, number one, I think there is more programming. People were wanting to make more TV shows than what you could fit on the 3 networks. And number 2, I mean, the reason you make TV shows is because, and then the reason that TV became a thing in the first place is because you can sell ads on it. And so American TV, if you ever talk to somebody who's from like Great Britain or other countries, but especially from the UK, their TV programming is completely different because their ad breaks they don't have ad breaks. You watch it's like a podcast. You get a pre-roll and a post-roll kind of ad. You don't have a break in the middle, and they're not built in like they are on American TV. Fox really wasn't a network. It was and it was kind of genius. They built that purposefully as a collection of stations because it let them fly under the radar with the FCC and get around some of the rules that were in place for the
Married with Children. I mean, holy cow, that show like was groundbreaking.
Yeah. There's no way that Married with Children makes it on one of the other 3 networks. It doesn't happen. But where Fox really takes off and becomes truly a 4th network is it starts with The Simpsons, like you mentioned. That's a huge, huge hit that has been going for my entire life, basically, and shows no sign of stopping anytime soon. But you get that, and then they were just able to tap into some programming that was like a little bit more, a little bit edgier than what you could do with the other networks. And in some cases, a little sleazier and a little bit, they were just more willing to try different stuff. So
we were not allowed to watch Married with Children in our house. Like that was
same here. No.
Show,
yeah.
Get your butt over here right now. If you like it real as it can feel, come now. If you like a look that ain't strictly by the books, now. So Fox. It's gonna wake you up, and it's gonna make you happy. It's gonna shake you up, and it's gonna make you sing.
Okay, folks, here comes the big finish.
But Fox was not a network, and even though it was a network, because of the way that they, to be defined as a network, you had to offer a certain amount of hours of programming per week. And so they didn't do that. They started with like, we have Sunday night, and then they gradually added a night or 2 to what they had to offer. But even still, Fox still is the only of the 4 networks. On a Thursday night, you have 2 hours of programming, and then it goes to the early news. And that's still part of the process of kind of staying under the radar.
Which I remember in the early 80s, my dad came home and said, here's the deal. We're going to get cable TV. I remember this thing called SportsCenter that I saw that was solely highlights for a half hour. I remember when MTV came around and that song, "We're Not Gonna Take It." I remember my brother and I were dancing around, knocking over the lamp, and my mom was like threatening to kick cable out the door. Cable changed everything within the television landscape, did it not?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest, the internet is a bigger jump, but I think cable TV is definitely undersold as how revolutionary it was because it allowed people to find their niche. If you were into music, you could watch MTV. Yes, they played music back then. If you were into
Yeah.
sports, like I was as a kid, you could watch, like, you know, I didn't have YouTube, right? I was born in 86. So like when I was a kid, there wasn't all these, you know, the on demand of whatever. So I would just watch Sports Center on a loop, you know, sometimes 3 times a night in the summer, just to like get my sports fix and things like that, because I was a sports fan, right? If you're into gardening, there was like HGTV. If you were into, you know, it allowed networks to solely target around one niche and for people to find those.
200 channels and nothing to watch? That wasn't always a problem in America, because we didn't always have 200 channels. Everything changed when cable was born. Back in the 1940s, broadcast television was transforming the country. TV signal was transmitted from local towers to rabbit ear antenna, but reception was a hit or miss. Not everyone could get a signal. So a few enterprising Americans found a workaround. One of them being John Walson, a TV salesman in rural Pennsylvania. Walson put an antenna on a hilltop and ran a wire down to his TV store. The idea of cable was born. By 1952, these community antennas serviced 14,000 cable subscribers in 70 different places nationwide. And unlike local broadcasters, antenna operators could pick up signals from far away, allowing cable customers to access new content. In 1972, Charles Dolan launched Home Box Office, or HBO. 4 years later, in 1976, Ted Turner founded what would become TBS, and later created CNN. The cable industry gave rise to new titans, who took advantage of satellite technology to reach larger audiences. By the 1990s, cable took off, and there were millions of subscribers to dozens of cable companies across the country. Cable reached millions of American households for decades. And then the internet arrived. First, it was just dial-up, like your old AOL free trial CDs. You remember those. Service traveled over old copper phone lines owned by phone companies. Cable providers quickly realized that the fat wires they had built to transmit hundreds of TV channels could also be used to provide internet service. So they started selling high-speed internet with their cable bundles. Suddenly, illegally downloading that Red Hot Chili Peppers album on Napster got a whole lot faster. But stringing every household in America with cable wire is expensive. Cable companies effectively divided up the country rather than compete directly against each other. Content providers then created more and more channels. Cable operators paid to carry them and passed on fees to consumers. This left Americans with high bills and confusing bundle options. Today, millennials especially have cut their cable subscriptions and flocked to streaming services like Hulu and Netflix, which are more affordable and, supply endless content to meet the binge-watching demand. The shift has had profound effects. Media companies like Disney and Viacom relied on money from cable bundles for decades. Now they're struggling to transform in the new world. For Disney, that means buying a huge chunk of 21st Century Fox, a deal that will increase its suite of TV shows and movies. Meanwhile, cable companies are relying on selling internet service and looking to also expand into the cell phone industry.
She's got no Wi-Fi.
So, how these companies, regulators, and consumers navigate this new world of options will determine the future of cable.
Why did we need cable television? What did it bring us?
So I just think it's that, and you're right, because Fox comes after cable starts, but it had really a cable mentality, just sort of slightly toned down to be kind of a network kind of thing. Cable comes up partly because we can sell ads on it, and partly because we're in the 80s especially, we're starting to see more and more content being created or opportunities to make content, and there's just not a place for it to go. I came in, I talked about the NBA last year. I'm a big NBA guy. In the even into the early to mid 80s, the NBA finals games were tape delayed because NBC or whoever, ABC wasn't going to preempt like whatever sitcom was doing really well that night. And so there's all this content available or opportunity to make the content. And people were smart enough to figure out there's a way that we can monetize this. With ESPN, you put on that thing, ESPN, MTV, those are two of the big ones. It's so funny to me that like ESPN in its early days is showing, you probably remember this better than I do, is showing like bowling during and like prime time, you know, or like random game. The Australian rules football was a huge part of ESPN's early slate because they didn't have any rights to the broadcast on anything. MTV just kind of steps into that void of like, up to that point, music videos are only available here and there as like gaps in the programming on the networks, or like, you know, Casey Kasem's type of thing. Like maybe there's like maybe you have a slot at 11 a.m. on a Saturday that shows 30 minutes of music videos or something like that, and there's hundreds and hundreds of bands that are producing music or capable of producing music videos, and MTV just kind of steps into the void. And plus, and you also have the money of the 80s. I mean, the capitalism of the 80s is a huge part of the history of America.